Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for being here. My name is Alex White, Director General here at the Institute. So I'd welcome all of you who have attended here in North Great George Street this afternoon, and of course also those of you who are joining us online for this hybrid presentation. It's great to have everybody here. I want to thank in particular Ambassador Jenny Piaget, the Swiss Ambassador to Ireland, and her team for their collaboration with the Institute in putting together this, I think, what is going to be a very interesting, important and stimulating event. I also want to thank Susan Daly, who's Managing Editor of the Journal Media, who's going to moderate the discussion for us in a moment. But before that happens, it's my pleasure to invite to the podium the Deputy Head of Mission of the Embassy of Switzerland here in Ireland, Andreas Lucy. Say a couple of words.
Thank you very much, Alex. On behalf of the Embassy of Switzerland, I would like to thank the IIEA and the entire team for their excellent cooperation on this project, as well as all the panelists for their commitment to today's event. Promoting democracy is highly relevant given the current geopolitical situation. As you know, in recent years, the social, political, and media climate has changed significantly in many democracies. And this development was well documented in the latest Global Democracy Report 2025. Early this year, Switzerland published its democracy guidelines. And these guidelines are part of Switzerland's foreign policy strategy, aiming to support democracies around the world through international dialogue, and to promote democracy as an attractive and resilient model. Therefore, today's discussion highlights the importance of active participation and shared democratic values. I wish everyone an inspiring and meaningful conversation. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming and sparing your lunch times to us. I think there is, pardon the pun, a lot of meat on this topic because we have an incredible panel of experts on it. I think we won't even have enough time for your questions. No, we will, honestly. I think it's a very engaging topic. The title, of course, is Reimagining Democracy, Participatory Democracy and the Future of Democratic Innovation. As mentioned, I'm Susan Daly, I'm Managing Editor with Journal Media. We have a very big news outlet. We also run an investigative unit and a fact-checking unit. And I think that has brought us very close to what the online narrative has been. And one of the things that we're seeing is that the discourse, it's not just around, I'm not having my say. There is a fundamental undermining of what the definition of democracy is. This no longer looks like a democracy to me. At least that's what people are being told online, where they're trying to go for their answers. So I'll be really interested in hearing how potentially some of the democratic alternatives might provide solutions to people in this area. I want to introduce our distinguished guests. I should say if anybody is, well, I would say ex-posting, I'm not sure how we describe it anymore, at IIEA is a useful tag to use. And we will, of course, be giving lots of time to Q&A, both online if people are watching or here in the audience. So with me, I am going to go in order of, I could say, equal excellence, but I'll say in order to proximity to me. We have Professor Daniel Kobler, who's Professor at the Department of Political Science and Director of the Center for Democracy Studies in the University of Zurich. And he has been a director of, I would say, many centers of research in this area, such as the Democracy Studies ARU and academic director of the NCCR Democracy Program, which is really interesting. Had political journalism and communications and, you know, really interesting multidisciplinary approach, which we might talk about. We have Associate Professor Joseph Lacey, who's founding director of the Center for Democracy Research, School of Politics and International Relations at University College Dublin, with PhD from University College Oxford. I think it's important we know he has published a book, which I think we'll all have to read after this, called Centripetal Democracy, Democratic Legitimacy in Belgium, Switzerland, and the European Union. So has great expertise on democracy and international politics. And Louise Caldwell has so much experience in our own very Irish version of participatory democracy. She's a communications and business development professional, but she served voluntarily, fair play, in the Irish Citizens Assembly from 2016 to 2018. Recommendations from which we know have led to seismic referendums, such as that on the Eighth Amendment, which led to some regulation or legislation for abortion in Ireland. She's an advocate, I think, and this is kind of important for, I suppose, visibility of the conversation we're having today. She's an advocate for participatory and deliberative processes as a mechanism for empowerment and social justice, and speaking and writing and contributing to panels internationally to the same. So welcome to you all, and I believe we're going to have a few minutes from each of you to kind of set out your own take on, in particular, I suppose, what we're looking today, participative democracy, how you think it might work, and whether or not there are challenges that we have to foresee. Shall we take it in this order? Are you comfortable with that, Professor? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to the institution. So if you invited me here, I think this is because you wanted to know about the Swiss system. So I'm going to maybe start with setting the scene and then talk about some challenges that we're facing in Switzerland for the moment. So in Switzerland, we have three main institutions at the federal level of direct democracy. There is a so-called mandatory referendum. Anything that requires a constitutional change needs to be automatically put for referendum and needs to be voted on by the citizens and the cantons. Then there is the optional referendum. Any parliamentary decision can be asked to be voted upon by 50,000 citizens when they sign up in the time of 100 days. So parliamentary decisions, then you can see when it's published, referendum period is running, and people have 100 days to collect 50,000 signatures. If they succeed, then the decision needs to be put to a popular vote and needs to pass the popular vote to be accepted. The third main instrument is the popular initiative, where actually people can sign up to suggest change in legislation or at the constitutional level if 100,000 citizens ask for that in the period of 18 months. So these are the these are the three main institutions at the federal level. As you can imagine, there is a lot of voting because there is a lot of possibilities to ask for votes. There's lots of need to vote because of constitutional change that the parliament suggests. And we vote basically on 7 to 8 different questions, laws, constitutional changes per year. So the Swiss are will never be, world champions in football, but they are world champions in voting for these reasons. And there are a couple of questions also that we have or that currently are up for debate with respect to this system. One of the first, so I'm just going through in not any order or something. A big question is what do we do with initiatives, popular initiatives that are accepted? Usually popular initiatives are rejected. 1 out of 10 is accepted in history. So it hasn't happened very frequently. So we didn't have to bother with what to do with an accepted popular initiative. But as popular initiatives are more frequent, more popular, they are also more frequently accepted, and the parliament then has to formulate legislation that implements the will of these popular initiatives. And that has led to system overload because some of the questions are really tricky. If people want to, if people vote for a popular initiative that asks that immigration be controlled by Switzerland itself, and this is contradictory to the bilateral agreement with the European Union, what can you do? Parliament chose a law to implement this this initiative, which actually was a non-implementation of this decision. So that's a way out of the conundrum, but of course people don't like it very much. So the question is a bit what to do with popular initiatives that are accepted to avoid system overloads. Another big issue is that for the moment, citizens' rights and the way in which we practice direct democracy is very, let's say, paper pencil based. It's not digitalized in any way. Postal voting is generalized, so everyone receives a postal, stuff at home that you can fill in. You can write yes or no. You can put it in an envelope and send it by mail. So it's very easy, but it's not digitalized. Same for collecting signatures for initiatives or referendum. People can stand in the street, ask people, would you sign the initiative, whatever, or the referendum against this and that law, and then you have to trust that people actually fill in. But last year it came up that there was an industrial, cheating on in signature collection, and this undermined heavily the trust in this institution. And the federal chancellery, who's in charge of this, has not found a way out. The easiest thing would be to digitalize everything. But then, of course, there is the question of, is this too much of a control on citizens? So that's another conundrum that is not solved. A third one is that campaign funding has always been an issue. Campaign funding has been protected. Well, the campaign funding secrecy was even more protected than the bank secrecy in Switzerland. So it was extremely arcane who funded the campaigns, by whom, et cetera, and only in 2022 there was a new regulation introduced that makes it compulsory to disclose the sources of funding for referendum campaigns. It has had some difficulties in implementation, but now it's up and running, and there are some surprising insights into this campaign funding. We might come back to that. So there is, I think this will be giving also more issues to discuss in the future. So these are, I think I'll leave it at that for the moment. So as you can see, we're maybe champions in voting, but we don't have every problems. It's not without problems, not without issues, and there are many issues that are still under discussion that we have to solve.
I think that's a great, we will come back to that question of maybe weaponizing these processes in some way. You know, if you can influence the conversation online in general, can you also influence something where there's a lot of participation? So that's really, I will be back to you on that. Would you like to give us a few words there, Joseph?
So thanks again to everybody for the invitation. And I guess I'll just start off by saying that I'm a big fan of both referendums and citizens' assemblies, with the crucial caveat being when they're designed correctly. So what does a good design look like? Well, for referendums, I think the Swiss and the Irish model are actually excel in terms of design, because they're designed to be a check on political power, right? Not a tool in the hands of the governments to be used when it's expedient for them to do so. So if you take the Brexit referendum, for example, this wasn't a check on power. It was an attempt to solve a failure in the British party system to solve the Europe question. So just think of how absurd it is that David Cameron decided to call this referendum to stop squabbles in his own party, and then he actually goes and campaigns for the EU to stay, or for the UK to stay in the EU, which being the status quo. Now, think of Ireland. The government first has to form a will to do something, to change the constitution. Ireland, the government needs to say, we want to do X. Then a referendum is automatically triggered to make sure that the people are okay with that. So our referendums are a check on power. They're inconvenient for the government, and I think that's how it should be. And I think referendums in Switzerland, like the optional referendum, the mandatory referendum in particular, serve this check on power as well. So in terms of a citizens' assembly, what does a good design look like? Well, fundamentally, citizens' assemblies are about deliberation, right? They're, which is reason giving for what is in the best interest of the political community. So for this, you need a good amount of time to consider it. You need access to expertise and good facilitators. And there are two thornier issues, though. That's all fairly straightforward. There are two thornier issues that I'd want to discuss. So the first thornier issue is who should be included in the assembly. And the second is what kind of authority the assembly should have, and even what kind of authority it should seem to have by politicians and by citizens. So on the first question of who should be selected, I don't think there's just one answer. So I think there's several ways of doing it, and Ireland has a couple of examples as to how to do it. So in the 2013-2014 Convention on the Constitution, it included 2/3 citizens randomly selected and 1/3 politicians. And a critique of the time was that, well, this would not be a pure assembly, right? Because it had politicians and they're going to take over the process. That didn't happen. Politicians gave great contributions, and with good facilitation, they didn't dominate the discussion. So that worked well. The 2016 Citizens Assembly was, again, a pure assembly, 99 citizens, and everyone after that has been a pure assembly. And that worked really well too. So I'm not sure that there's one design necessarily in terms of who should be participated, whether politicians should be excluded, and so on. I think so long as the facilitation is done right, it's the key. Then on the second issue concerning what authorities assemblies should be given or seen to have, I think it should always be consultative to help inform our elected representatives. So in other words, I think the deliberations of the Citizens Assembly should be just one important data point in the government's and the public's wider deliberations about how to pursue public policy. And I think that's largely how the government has in Ireland treated Citizens Assemblies recommendations as just one input into the policy process and not the determination of it. But I think a problem arises when too much moral authority is given to Citizens Assemblies because they are this kind of like arena of the citizens. And you sometimes hear this when the government doesn't follow something the Citizens Assemblies has recommended, right? It's kind of like, well, the citizens said it, then why aren't you following it? So, and the reason I think Citizens Assemblies have very limited moral authority is because they're poorly expressive of political autonomy, which is what democracy is fundamentally based on, right? You express your political autonomy when you go out to vote, when you personally get informed on issues, when you contact your representatives to register your views or whatever. So Citizens Assemblies are great expressions of deliberation, but they ultimately exclude the vast majority of citizens from the deliberations. And I don't think most citizens would want their representatives going along with Citizens Assembly recommendations when the representatives themselves or their constituents don't really believe or don't follow those recommendations. And I have an inkling that this is at least partly what happened in our 2024 referendums, which were heavily defeated. So politicians more or less took two recommendations from the 2021 Citizens Assembly on the definition of the family and the Constitution. And meanwhile, there didn't seem to be sufficient constituency level deliberation to gauge where people stood on these issues, with the Citizens Assembly just being relied on too much. So I think there's a risk of Citizens Assemblies being given too much moral authority and not seen as just one very important data point. And there's a risk then that they can supplant other forms of deliberation, such as at the constituency level, and ultimately put unwarranted pressure on politicians. So that's just an overall view of saying kind of like a supportive of both of these institutions when they're designed in a certain way and some of the potential risks to that. Thank you.
Louise, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I am assuming that you are a fan of Citizen Assemblies as well, but you're the person with the lived experience, so we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I suppose what I'm going to say is probably going to sound quite different to the gentleman on the panel. So I was randomly selected to take part in the Irish Citizens Assembly in 2016. So what that looked like was a man knocked on my door. I live in the middle of rural Meath. It's very unusual for anyone to knock on my door. Even more unusual for me to hear it and to answer it. So I had been at home all summer with my kids, and this man was from a polling company, and he was explaining to me that they were putting together a panel of people randomly selected. We were going to talk about some issues related to society, and it would involve going to a hotel once a month. And I thought, once a month, having grown-up conversations out of this house, sign me up, right? So that's been perfectly honest, so you have to understand sometimes the random selection is a really important part of how we choose people to take part in these processes, and why they sign up in the beginning might not be the reason why they stay, okay? I didn't fully understand what it was I was signing up for, to be honest, and even probably it took me a couple of weekends in the room before it started to fully load. Okay, I think I know what's happening here. It's a very different experience. So what that did for me was it ignited a civic spirit that was previously dormant, essentially. I mean, I had never been involved in politics. I'd never done really any activism work. I'd never, I voted always, but, and I think probably what happened for me was a very deep personal transformation. And I wasn't the only one. I know this for sure, because I've had many conversations with other assembly members, in that we learned that we actually have capacities that we didn't realize we had to have very difficult conversations, to process really difficult and complex information, to synthesize that information in a way that was allowing us to make recommendations to the Oireachtas. And essentially what we did in that particular topic of the Eighth Amendment was we drafted the legislation, essentially, you know, in those 5 weeks. So I think it's very important to, when we think about, you know, this topic of deliberation, and I heard it said earlier, you know, this is about democracy beyond elections. And I think that's a really core piece here. It's what can we do to ignite a civic spirit in people who are overwhelmed and who are already feeling like life is too much and there's too much information. You know, and access to information is really important, but it's not the same as giving people the space to really process that information, to be able to make good decisions. And that's what I think these types of processes do really well. And I feel like, you know, when I'm imagining what it was like for me back in that time, you know, you mentioned, Joseph, you know, that it's just 99 people. You know, are we truly representative? What was really interesting was, of the people I spoke with, and we were at different tables every weekend, so we were always being mixed up with different people. You know, people were there with the civic sense of, I am here to represent people that I know and that I think of in my community. And also people maybe then, as you go through the weekends, people that you can widen your view and go, okay, well, I'm not directly affected by this, but what if I ever was, or what if somebody I knew was? So it's kind of constantly widening, you know, the capacity to be able to try to consider what is in the best interest of society, you know, in the context of where we were at that time. I think that the dialogue and the process that happens in a Citizens Assembly is equally, if not more important than the outcomes. I don't think that gets enough attention. You know, we're very often focused on, oh, well, these were the outcomes. And I think what can be missing is that the process in itself is a transformative process for the people who take part. And I think that they become better citizens. I became a better citizen. I became a better person as a result. And I think that that's not just me. And we've now probably got like 1,000 people who've been through the Citizens Assembly in Ireland. You know, I guarantee they're all out there doing more stuff than they would have done before. You know, so in itself, that was an intrinsically valuable process to put these people through, regardless of the outcomes. So that's the piece I like to say. The other piece I wanted to pick up on was, you know, Daniel, you were mentioning about, you know, the paper and the pencil based. You know, there's so many more tools that are available now for digital participation, and not just on a national level. And I think this is where in Ireland we've really focused in on the National Citizens Assembly on very large topics. But I think there's lots of other tools that we could be using. You know, there's mini publics, which are, you know, light. You know, they're stealth. You know, not stealthy. The other word. What is it? They don't cost as much, they don't, you know, they don't take as long to organise, they don't require as many people, but they can be used very successfully for local level. I think we have a really close connection to our electorate in Ireland, which is very unusual in, you know, a global context. But how we make decisions and how we do participation in county councils, for example, or at that level, could be much more participative. You know, we could do, you know, I suppose what I'd love to see in the organisation that I'm in is, I'm involved in a global organisation now called People Powered, which brings together practitioners who are from civil society organisations, civil servants, NGOs, who are working with these types of tools to increase the voices and the listening and the opportunity for people who are in the context of, you know, be it a local community, be it a climate active group, be it a decision-making process that needs to happen at a national level. But they're using lots of innovative tools. You know, we've got mini publics, we've got participatory budgeting, which is so underused, and it's so effective because it leads to a direct outcome and people understand it very quickly. Oh, right, I'm going to have my say on how this 100,000 euros of county council money is going to be spent. And they have a direct input into that and a direct link to the output. And it's money that's already been spent by governments. So, you know, it's a really, I think, very simple way to increase participation. And then we have like legislative theatre, which is another really innovative and creative tool that brings together policymakers and stakeholders who are affected by a particular issue. And it really playfully allows people to see what this issue plays out like for the other people in the room. A very good example of that is Manchester City and Borough County Council did one in relation to homelessness, which brought together, you know, the mayor, and it brought together all the senior stakeholders. And they had a transformative experience of understanding and playing with and playing the roles, and they make a little play and they act it out of what exactly is the experience of somebody trying to do this job within the existing system. And it allowed policymakers to go, I can see now what the problem is. So there's lots of different tools like that that are really transformative and that are very much participative and that can be really inviting and engaging and community building, because people can see the other experience of the other person in a way that is very difficult to communicate in any other way. That's all I have for now.
So point that kind of crosses everything that you're saying at the moment, which I think is to bring it back to the basic level of, I think everyone on this panel has a really good grasp, and within this room, of the kind of processes we're talking about, and some of the options are out there and very well laid out by our panelists. Are we fundamentally missing an outreach to the general public, though, a literacy around the possibilities that these things can offer them? Because there was a mention of judicial system, and while 1,000 people is a lot, it's very, very small portion of the Irish society to have had, I suppose, the opportunity to go through that transformative experience and come out of it feeling more civically engaged. What an amazing process, but it's how to apply that at scale. It's like when someone goes on jury service, they get to see how the courts work. And anyone I know who's gone through that, they also come out of it feeling more informed and so on. How do we, as a fundamental part of it, whatever the society is, reach people and say there is another way? Are there any societies where this works particularly well? We talk about the Swiss society, which is part of their DNA now, is to have participation. It's expected. In Ireland, we've been able to talk about our citizens' assemblies on an international stage. It's seen as a model that people can look at. But then we have highly polarized societies. If we look at what's happening in the US, do these kind of things work differently depending on the starting ground? And what can we do to prep the starting ground so we even have the opportunity to use tools that are different?
I mean, like in terms of reaching people, like I think it's quite difficult. And this is one place it's been tried is like in Taiwan. So there's a thing called V-Taiwan, which is, you know, this mass deliberation. So one critique of citizens' assemblies, like I mentioned, is few people. And okay, well, let's get everybody involved. We open the platform up and we have these online, so it goes back to a technology point, online discussions, and people come in, and that feeds into the Taiwanese government policy process if one of the discussions gets sponsored by a person in government. And that's, you know, there's, you know, I'm all in favor for more discussion and more deliberation with people. But when you do that, if you actually look at what the breakdown is, I think the largest discussion, even though it has had impact, by the way, this in legislation, like it's around like between 300 people and 2,300 people participate. So it's voluntary, right? So what you're getting then is the most active people. It's getting skewed in that way. And that's the advantage of citizens' assemblies, because you don't get that skew. You get these people who haven't really necessarily thought about it too much. And so you get that, I guess, purer way. So you're trading off participation for deliberation here. So I think it's really difficult to actually, if your goal is to get people involved, I've never seen it being done in any way other than getting people to vote in elections or referendums, because it gives people a focus point that makes them feel that, well, your vote's going to count towards something, and so on. So, but then in terms of like what do you do to prepare the ground, and I think absolutely different contexts matter differently. People will often say like, oh, citizens' assemblies wouldn't work here, or referendums wouldn't work there, you know, and we talk about polarized times, but you know, electoral democracy itself struggles in polarized times. So I think it's not an excuse to not try these things. It's just something. It's kind of like, okay, our system is as it is. We're facing these problems. That's what democracy is. I think is an experiment over hopefully centuries or longer. Is to actually say, okay, we have this problem. Let's try this thing, you know, start it small, like do it like in the Irish case, we started small with Citizens Assembly, you know, maybe if that went so well, we could reform the Seanad, for example, to be a rolling full-time Citizens Assembly and a constant deliberative body, something like that, right? I mean, these are all sorts of options that these smaller experiments can really lead towards. So I would be very reluctant to say, oh, we have these circumstances, we shouldn't try such and such, but no, you try it on a small scale, and then you bring it up.
So you mentioned having a focal point like an election, for example, at the moment, and we've had conversations around the presidential election, and the focus has been not so much about, and we would be monitoring disinformation online, not so much about disinformation on individual candidates, but rather around the election integrity, what it takes to get nominated, and people being, I suppose, fed a certain number of narratives around that it's not democratic, that we can never really have this election, which is such a direct one, you know, and there's so few candidates this time that even the proportional representation system won't have a huge impact on the outcome. But it is, you know, you can see that people are geared towards, I can see what the impact of this is. I will know whether this worked or not. In the Swiss example, for example, the impacts, if you're asking people to go and deliberate and participate and vote so often, do they always have to have that impact in front of them? Something will change. Louise, you outlined that what was powerful about the Citizens Assembly here was you were given a framework and say, you know, we'll ask you to do this, this, and this, and at the end we'll have section recommendations. They'll go here, they'll be deliberated upon, and this may happen. So you had some sense this was going somewhere, it wasn't a talking shop. One imagines the Swiss citizenry can see impact of their votes, or
of course, I mean, the vote is binding.
Mm-hmm.
So if things are rejected, the law will not enter into force. So if you want to regulate issues that are salient to people, they see the point in going to vote. So that's also the reason why turnout fluctuates very, very much. So if there are some very famous examples where turnout was very low because people didn't understand if that law made any difference for their personal lives. But there were opportunities where laws were very consequential, and there will be a vote coming up in 2 years' time on the new treaties with the European Union. I think that will have a hell of a turnout because people think it is extremely important. It will have extremely wide-ranging consequences, and that's why they will turn out. So if people have the feeling that it's salient to them, they will turn out. The point is, I would like to come back to the question: how can we reach out to people and increase participation? Because paradoxically, in Switzerland, the interesting thing is that there is a lot of opportunities to participate, especially at the local level. So municipalities, for instance, in German-speaking part of Switzerland, they would not have a council or something. They would have a government and a citizen assembly, which would, reunite twice a year to decide about the budget, decide about other things. And they have a huge problem. Turnout is extremely low. People don't go. Because even though they could make decisions, and these decisions would affect, their very daily lives, because it affects, street planning and whether you want to have this pedestrian crossing or not, people don't go. And so there is at the federal level, I wouldn't say so, but at the local level, there is really a weakening of civic engagement at the citizen level. And in this context, it was interesting to me that we tried out some deliberative mini publics. So we had a project that was involved organizing 3 deliberative mini publics, and we did some research on those, etc. And the interesting thing was that the politicians were extremely keen on having these mini publics because they felt uneasy about this the civic engagement disappearing, because they had the feeling that always the same people were participating and not necessarily the ones that were representative for the various opinions in the community. So they were extremely pleased with being able, through random selection, to reach out to people they had never seen, and also to hear point of views that they had never heard. So this helped them actually make the policy decisions closer to what people actually wanted. And I think that's random selection has an incredible potential, especially on the background of, let's say, weakening civic engagement, to actually invite people. And it's different. As you say, I love that story that we were talking about, because we had exactly the same experience in the 3 communities where we did that. People said, oh, never had I thought that anyone would care about my political opinion. So I felt very pleased being invited here. A few of those people actually then started to get interested in politics and started to to join a party in the local community, run for office. And I even have a political science student who actually was a became a political science student because he was politicized in one of those mini publics. So I think, let's say, awakening the interest for politics and make people understand that in a democracy you have a say, you can make a difference. I think that's the most important thing, and probably the time being we have to invite people more to actually ask for what they think, not just waiting that they come.
I think this might indicate that they'll work more powerfully then in a society or a political system that welcomes the input of its citizens. So, you know, it's kind of relates back to that question. There was, you know, Citizens Assemblies are having a moment when the New Yorker writes a multi-thousand-word article on it, which I've read. It's from just over a year ago, but there was a quote from it where these gatherings do what most democracies only pretend to: trust normal people to make decisions on difficult policy questions. Now, Irish Citizen Assemblies, the one you were talking about specifically, were involved in, Louise, that was quite a sensitive subject. And is there a sense that there are some topics that politicians or other people who are experts in the area would shy away from putting to a wider participatory platform, such as the Citizens Assembly, where there are all eyes on whether these recommendations are going to be followed through? Or how does that get managed? Louise, did you sense any reluctance, or was it built in from the start that, you know what, we trust people to have good conversations? How is it influenced? But there were expert speakers, obviously, involved. What kind of things support the decision-making of ordinary people in these difficult topics?
Well, I think, first of all, not every topic is suited for a Citizens Assembly, you know, and I think one of the things I came away with very strongly was a real appreciation for how difficult a task politicians actually have making good decisions with lots of really complex information coming at them all the time from all angles. So, you know, that was a significant outcome for me. It was a new appreciation of how difficult that job is, and an absolute certainty that I would never want that job. So, but I think that, you know, how ours were structured, for example, in the meetings where we were deliberating on the 8th Amendment, it was set up that we were coming towards a referendum question, which is going to be a yes or a no. Okay, so that's important. So when you have a yes or a no, then you have panelists and speakers who are either one or the other. And we would have had medical, legal, ethical speakers across all of the weekends from both sides. They never said which side they were from, and sometimes it wasn't immediately apparent, actually. But there was always a balance in the information that we were receiving. And that sometimes absolutely bamboozled us, can I tell you, because it really did make it much more difficult then, because you could be listening to someone going, yeah, agree with what he said, yeah. And then the opposite side would come up and you'd be, yeah. It's like, oh God, I agree with both, but I actually can't agree with both. So what does that mean then? And that's where the meat of the deliberation comes in. You know, and then we would have, at the round tables, we would have conversation starters. They're very important. When you talk about design, I could see much further in the process, you know, several topics later, how important those questions are and how, you know, it's really influential on how the discussion goes at the table. You know, those conversation starters, they can frame a direction of a conversation quite significantly, which is why very good facilitation is really important, to make sure that each person is invited to give their opinion, even if, you know, you've got very quiet people at the table. You know, there's a note taker who has his little grid and he has to put something in for everybody. So, you know, you really have to talk, even if it's just to say no. You know, you have to say something. So I think that the design of the process is really important in how the topics are deliberated on. But not all the topics and not all of the, you know, it doesn't always need to lead to direct action, you know, like a referendum. In the climate weekends, you know, that took a long time for the recommendations to actually filter down into, you know, the Climate Act and different things like that, you know, and there's still a long tail of activity that's been drawn on from those recommendations and from those deliberations. So while it mightn't always have an immediate kind of, oh, well, that had an outcome, there's still value in the deliberation and the thoughtfulness and the time given to deep consideration of complex things that have maybe a longer term impact on society than the political cycle, you know.
Yes,
so I think,
Joseph, have you any examples of this being a challenge? There are certain subjects that shouldn't be put in front of the citizenry, or if they need a very particular framework. How do you have people talk about really complex? We talk about EU referendums ending up with the public. We've had experience of that in Ireland where we haven't always had success. We've had to kind of go back and explain again, and maybe the work wasn't put in. What works and doesn't work in that sense, or how do you feel about it?
In terms of for referendums or for citizens' assemblies?
For citizens' assemblies, and then on with that, what should or shouldn't go to referendums, I suppose, how informed the public is.
Yeah, no, I think for what you want citizens' assemblies focusing on are kind of like ultimately like value-based. So like things that are very technical, for example, like, you know, should we, and actually there are some referendums in Switzerland that can be quite technical, like should we invest in this particular kind of military equipment or something, like, or I can't remember what it was I saw, but there's some of them can be quite technical. And I think kind of like more value-based things, like, you know, that obviously you need to have information and facts for values, but I think it's those kinds of decisions that work best. And for referendums, I think it's ones that have to do with something that's going to alter the direction of the political community fundamentally. Like, you know, this is what I think, you know, you need to have public buy-in for big things like the like treaties on the EU and so on. And I think, you know, I think these things, like while people were not necessarily happy with the deliberative process, and you might put some of that on the politicians for not really explaining the case very well in our Nice and our Lisbon referendums. But, you know, I think this kind of consultation really makes a difference. And Ireland and Denmark have been doing this. The UK was asked once in the 70s did they want to join, and never again until all of this tension boiled up. So if they maybe had a few more referendums like we did, saying, okay, well, do you want to be part of this? Do you want to be part of this? Maybe this kind of gives British citizens a bit more sense of control over their own destiny within the EU, rather than just kind of saying, well, you made your decision and that decision lasts forever until, as we saw in 2016, it doesn't.
May I come to you, Daniel, before there's some great questions coming in online. I'm sure there's some in the room. Mike is. Okay.
So things that should or should not be put to referendum.
I mean,
my very strict perspective is that there is nothing that shouldn't be put to a referendum. As you say, things can get very technical, but my favorite stuff is tax reforms, because they get extremely technical. There was a tax reform on corporate tax a couple of years ago. This was so complex that even the politicians wouldn't understand what it was about. So if you listen to them in parliamentary debate or on the TV explaining things, it's like, oh, this is extremely difficult. But what would the alternative be? Leave it to the politicians? I cannot see why politicians should be better able to decide these kind of technical issues than the people, or leave it to technocrats. That's not an alternative either. So I think anything must be able to be put to political participation. The condition that the decision then is well deliberated, well justified, is that there is a learning process that those who decide about this, be they politicians or citizens, go through to be able to make up their minds in a way that is commensurate with their own preferences in general political preferences. And if that's the case, I don't see any problems.
Even when it's something like tax reform, where politicians, you know, should it be left to them? They are often surrounded, though, by civil servants who can give them briefings, who can do the research. The average person, I mean, unless they get a leaflet in the door, which I'm assuming is pretty brief, how do you make sure that that's an informed decision?
The point is, do you always need an informed decision? I mean, you just said that at some point, the deliberation is about, you can hear the pro arguments, you can hear the con arguments, you can agree with both, but at some point you need to make up your mind. And in Switzerland, what often happens with very complex things that are put to vote is that people vote according to party cues. So the party X says, okay, you should vote yes to this tax reform. Party Y says you should vote no. And then if you have a general leaning towards this party, you can always follow their recommendations. So we call this heuristic voting, because you don't need to go through all the information or reading the tons of paper of the law and so on. But you can still think, okay, this party says this is a good thing, or this party says it's a bad thing. And you can still make up your mind if you know where your political preferences are. And actually, depending on the level of difficulty or technicality of laws, we can actually observe that the ratio of heuristic voting is increasing. So more technical issues, people are actually, rather than going through all the information, they vote according to party lines. And if you look at then what their political preferences are, they're actually quite commensurate with the choice they make. So I think you can vote, you can express your opinion on very difficult technical issues by following the experts that you trust. And that's what happens.
Excellent. I'm going to put aside my own questions because I can see we've hands up already here. Just a reminder that we're recording this, so questions and answers will be recorded. And we're 10 to 2, but if we can hold on a little bit longer than 2, we started a bit late, that gives us a little bit of time. If you're asking a question, if you don't mind speaking your name and any affiliation, that'd be really helpful. Go ahead.
I too participated in the 2012 and the 2016 Citizens Assemblies, but in a different way. I made submissions, which had to be done in writing, and I also attended as an observer on days on the topics that I was interested in. And I just want to say that I fundamentally disagree with Professor Lacey that referendums in Ireland are a check and balance on government. They are not. Why? Because governments are the only people who can initiate referendums. They control the legislature, or else they wouldn't be the government. And secondly, they also decide the timing of the referendum and the question to be asked. And similarly, they do exactly the same thing with citizens' assemblies. They decide the topics to be asked. They decide. Now, I just want to ask the two Irish people here. There is one topic that was considered on the both the 2012 and the 2016 Citizens Assemblies. It was approved by both assemblies with bigger majorities than voted for same-sex marriage or voted for the abortion referendum. What was that topic?
Sorry, could you say that again?
There was one, I'll answer my question.
I think I know the answer. It was the one on the manner in which referenda are held, was it?
Yes, but the topic on which there was a bigger majority was that we should have citizens' initiative here in this state, as we did when the state was founded. The guy who brought Citizens Assemblies here, David Farrell, has come out against the way in which it's been implemented here. And secondly, I will point out that having attended one of the assemblies, the one Judge Lafoy chaired, I saw I saw an expert give factually wrong information. I pointed it out to the expert. Nothing was done during the hearing. They corrected it afterwards. So I have a question then for Professor Kugler, is it? I met a Swiss politician a couple of years ago who was then Social Democrat and chairman of the Legislative Assembly of the Council of Europe. And he pointed out that in Switzerland, one of the things we have is with our Citizens Initiative, and we have four referendum days a year and they're known in advance. It means that we can talk about what it means to be Swiss 4 times a year. He said, that's what he said. The second thing is that the process of having the thing, it enables all kinds of discussion to go on, not necessarily in formal fora, but in pubs and at, football matches and in families and in groups. And that promotes greater understanding of common issues. And he said that that's very important in a deeply divided society like Switzerland with its 4 languages and its major two religions, but it enables the conflicts to be resolved, not through violence, but through greater understanding. So my question for you is, in coming to the digitalization of the Citizens Initiative process, have you looked at the Lisbon Treaty, which brought in the European Citizens Initiative and also brought in a digital means of signing that? And is that a model that, despite its disadvantages, it's complementary to the, have you looked at this? It's complementary to the paper-based system. Both of them are eligible under the Lisbon Treaty, the regulation for European Citizens Initiative. And I'm just wondering, is that something that has been considered in Switzerland at either federal, cantonal or local level?
So I think if you answer that a little bit about the technological tools available to increase participation, and we might then very quickly touch on the points there around, are there some challenges to the way assemblies? I know there had been, we would have seen that in the media, there would have been a lot of conversation around, well, who picked the experts? You know, the experts are guiding and so on. So give you a chance, you guys, to come back on that. But if we want to just touch on the technology.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very technical discussion about what are the means to make sure that people can sign up for referendums. So the problem is not so much the accessibility of the act of signing up for a referendum, but the problem is the need to let's say check if the person is actually exists. So if it's just if it's a fake signature or a real one. So I think the system you were mentioning would not prevent that problem, because if you still can sign up on paper and pencil, this doesn't solve that problem. And I think that the Swiss system of signature collection doesn't have a problem of accessibility, but a problem of trust in terms of veracity. Is the person existing, or is it just because there are companies that you can hire to collect signatures for your initiative or your referendum, and they they put people on the street or paid on the signature, and the more signatures they bring, the higher pay they receive, and they have a huge incentive to cheat. And
certain countries, the regulation have been implemented differently, say in Austria.
I know in Austria, but Austria has the problem that, so in Austria, for those who don't know, you have to go to the municipality, provide your ID, check, making sure that you are the person that is signing the thing. I think this is putting too much of a hurdle for the signature collection. In Switzerland, this would never pass, because the system works on the fact that it's very open and very easy to sign up for signature collection. So there's always the trade-off between putting too much of a hurdle to signature product and making sure that it's not a fake signature. And this problem is exactly the problem that is,
it's the problem online as well.
Yeah.
There's always way gaming the system. Very briefly, if I can, just because we have amazing questions here as well, Joseph and Louise, just if you want to have a little return there on, I suppose the dissatisfaction that some people might have had with those, and or maybe what we learn from that to kind of present a more robust assembly formation.
Well, no process is perfect. I remember you actually from the assembly, but no process is perfect. I mean, and that's not giving free rein for people to, design processes that are not rigorously thought through. But, that's the reality of it. And then I suppose we would have, as assembly members, received, corrections. Often in between, we would have gotten emails. We had binders full of reading material ahead of each weekend. So I think we did the best that we could with what we had.
You guys could ask for more expertise though, right? If you felt you needed.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we did that. We added a whole other weekend, and we asked for a whole other slant on. We were tired of listening to experts, essentially, so we got a whole weekend of just listening to people who had been affected.
Follow-up question on this one, because I was interested by the question on who defines what the assembly is going to debate. We had a mini public where the municipality actually formulated the question and deliberately framed it in a way that they wanted to keep the discussion on this particular topic. But the mini public didn't bother. They discussed other topics all the same, and then came up with recommendations which were completely out of the frame that the government had imagined. Did these kind of things happen in Ireland?
Yeah, certainly there was unexpected outcomes, I think. Yeah, for sure. And we certainly felt that we had enough, I think, agency within our briefing, if you like, to be able to have an impact on how the assembly went. You know, there was a steering committee of you know, citizens who were part of the kind of in between the meetings, who would have worked very closely with the Secretariat on setting those questions and on making sure that the framing was still working for the people in the room. Yeah.
Are you okay with that then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And just
Yep.
to say that, like, all of these things give further reason for why, you know, like the point, going back to the point, is that these should just be one part of a wider deliberation, because there are these different ways in which, like, you know, okay, who choose the expertise? Is everybody listening in the same way? Does everybody read the binder in a citizen? Say all of those kinds of things. So it's just kind of like, it's a really great input into our political deliberation.
Almost a starting point for
Yes.
us as well. There's a link to that. There's I'm going to take one from online if that's all right. John O'Brennan, who's a professor at Maynooth Universities, says a terrific discussion. Thank you all. Can I ask the panel what might be the best vehicle for a deliberative debate about the European Union? Is there a place for a permanent Citizens Assembly, for example, that could feed into Irish government positions at EU level? Is that welcome?
I think more deliberation and more discussion is always good, and something that kind of like can be a focal point for these kinds of discussions, can, you know, it can even get media attention and bring more people in on board in that way. So again, yeah, I think I'm very promiscuous when it comes to all of these things like that will just increase participation and deliberation, and that's one perfectly valid idea for me.
Is there a point there about the permanent position? Because one of the things we've been talking about was, you know, having something that's a deliberative process that is around a crisis point, or a moment in time. We have an election. We have something we need to decide upon that's going to change the constitution. So in Ireland, we have to have a referendum for that. That it ramps up. We want all the deliberation then, and then there's nothing in between times. Is that something that we should consider?
I mean, if I might mention not Switzerland, but Belgium this time, there is a region in Belgium, the German-speaking region, they do have a permanent citizen assembly. Permanent meaning not always the same people, but the assembly, and every year there's a new random selection of citizens who are participating in this citizen assembly, and they also have thought out a very sophisticated ways in connecting this citizen assembly to the other institutions like the parliament and the government, and also making sure that, you know, citizens on the previous assembly can have a say in what goes on. So there are examples of institutionalized citizen assemblies, and I think they're very promising.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that any vehicles that allow for deeper deliberation and deeper discussion on complex topics, I mean, it can't be a bad thing.
And potentially not seen as much as a box-ticking exercise. We'll consult you now because you seem to want it, but we're not actually, this is not a way in which we're consistently doing our democracy. Have we questions in the room before I go back? Yes, Seamus. Seamus, do you want to tell everybody at home where you are?
I'm Seamus Allen. I'm a researcher here at the Institute. Thank you so much. The discussion was really interesting. So I have a question about, so we talked a bit about the complex questions that might be put to referendums and citizen assemblies, but sometimes the answer can be complex. And do the panel have thoughts on how do we interpret what the people were actually voting for in a referendum? So I guess Brexit is a really good example of that, or some of our EU treaty referendums. And I think sometimes in Switzerland, you actually have 3 options that people can vote for maybe in a referendum, but a lot of the time here, it's kind of binary. It's a yes or no. And I'm wondering, do we need to think a bit how we designed a referendum to actually check what people are actually voting for? But yeah, I'll leave that for your thoughts. Thank you.
I mean, I think that's a great question, and ultimately it ends up being representative interpretation as to what it is. Sometimes that can be willful interpretation, right, used for political games. Okay, here's what does the referendum result mean, then becomes this rhetorical political battle sometimes. And it's even difficult to check that through polling sometimes, right? Because we know the difficulty with polling now is lots of people aren't answering their phones. Some people are just totally suspicious of polls. So people who are most likely to be the most anti-establishment and so on, maybe their views are not getting registered and picked up by any of this. So I actually don't have a great answer to this one at all. I think it's just a problem, and ultimately ends up, especially with more complex outcomes, becomes kind of often a political football, and who then has, but I guess there is a thing though of in terms of whose narrative then becomes the most convincing as a way forward, and that again in itself becomes its own, maybe deliberative might be the high ideal for it, but it becomes its own discursive process.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, it's how can we know what people voted for and why? You'll have to find out. And this is the way in which the government has to go. I remember a pension reform that was very important in Switzerland, you know, to ascertain the sustainability of the funding of the pension system. It was rejected for different reasons, and the government didn't know what to do. They asked we were in charge of the poll there, and my colleague went to see the minister and said, well, this is the reasons, this might be other reasons. And in fact, there was no answer. So the only answer was in the political process after this no to that pension reform to, you know, shape a new reform with the different things and then discuss them with everyone, consult with important players and so on, and then eventually find out if you have another go, if it's going to be accepted or not. So, well, the answer is in the process, you'll find out.
Louise, there were loads of things spoken about, right, in your sessions. I mean, you can only put so many in, but did you get a sense of it was understood in general? Because you made your own synopsis, really, right?
Yeah, I mean, how do you know if people are understanding something? I mean, it's difficult to check that even in an assembly process, you know. And there is also humans, you know, and we often hide our lack of knowledge behind kind of just agreeing with people or disagreeing with people, you know, that vulnerability that's required to be able to actually learn, you know, how we feel about things. That can be risky for people, you know, and I think that if it's supported at a table, you know, with good facilitation, it can invite that. But yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think, yeah, how do we know? I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I don't know if this is a solution exactly. Barbara Meany online doesn't say exactly what Barbara's role has been, but she's talking about Ireland has well-developed rights-based child and youth participation structures, such as Corlin and Oak, local youth councils and the National Youth Assembly of Ireland. Would you have experience of these, of getting youth involved at that earlier level? And how would those support deliberative democracy? I mean, it's building a pipeline of at least creating that muscle of having critical thinking and discuss. I mean, is that the way it goes? Is there an example of that? How do you prepare people to start their voting life in Switzerland?
So that's a good question. And the common sense answer is we don't, or not enough, because the polls show that compared to surrounding countries, Swiss young adults have less political knowledge than their peers in other countries, so we need to beef up on that. But there are youth parliaments and these kind of things, and I think the most important thing is that they need to be consequential in some way. So if you just reunite youth, young people to deliberate on a weekend, and there is no you know, consequence of what they suggest, that's super frustrating, and that will not, you know, motivate people to get involved. However, if you have a way of connecting these youth parliaments to the existing institutions, so like making a suggestion that the government then has to consider and at least debate, not necessarily accept, but at least debate and give reasons why the government thinks it cannot be followed or so, that would be a good way of you know, making these instances more appealing to people, and I think the basic thing is to get people interested in politics, and that's probably a good way to go.
I mean, is there a junior?
Yeah, so I think if I would spend all my time and energy on this youth participation, because I think that's where the biggest opportunity is. I see a lot of the members of People Powered very heavily involved in participatory budgeting in schools to enormous success. You know, it's such a wonderful tool to teach civics, to teach voting, to teach participation through action that has direct outcomes. You know, you've got schools who maybe have a budget of 5,000 euros, and you ask all of the students to put forward their proposals for how this money should be spent. They all vote on it. They all have to pitch their ideas on why it should be this, why it should be that. And ultimately, the money gets spent on the winning project. I mean, that is the entire thing in a nutshell. And if we can do that with young people at that age in a very tangible way that has a very direct outcome, we intelligently know that that is how then this could work in the bigger world as we go out and as we start to understand politics and, you know, how our voting rights and how our voice could be heard and how it could be, you know, having an impact on the world. I think if we've had that experience, very valuable.
There is a question there online about scalability of things like citizens assemblies. I mean, Joseph, does this kind of work allow us to do that for the future? This isn't just a...
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like that kind of like, I think youth exposure to these kind of things is really important, and that kind of way of actually implementing it in individual schools is a brilliant idea. But you know, there's other ways in which kind of to get citizens or young people more aware as well. And you know, I remember hearing, you know, these proposals to like lower the voting age to 16 and so on, and I was kind of thinking that doesn't make sense. But the research coming out about that is really impressive, right? And in particular, like if you care about people participating and voting through their lifetime, the earlier you start, because I mean, this is very clear, the better. And if you do it once, you will continue. And if you have it in, so everyone's in school under 16, you give them the right to vote. So, you know, the day of the vote becomes the school day. Everybody in the school goes together and vote. You can even have the structured deliberation around the vote. So you actually have people understanding, like, because, you know, it's kind of like, oh, you're 18, you're out of school, go vote. Okay, how do you vote? What's
Yeah.
So actually become almost automatically can become part of the school idea. And I think that I've been really compelled by the evidence for that. And I think that ties into youth involvement, and that would make more sense of the deliberation, even if I'm talking about efficacy, if it had a vote at the end of it. So
well, it's interesting because driver education, you know, there's a lot of push to get that much more in schools, because as adults people will be out driving and it's seen as a basic skill, but the ability to participate in your democracy and have your say, getting people while you can actually teach them rather than setting them when they're free at 18. That makes a lot of sense. Can I check if there's, I know we're up against it, is there anyone else in the room I haven't gotten to? Or
my name is Keane Fitzgerald. I'm also one of the researchers here at the IIEA. Just to Professor Kubler, you talked about this practice of heuristic voting, about taking indications from your party, but something I'm quite interested in that we didn't quite get to touch on is just the role of the information environment in these kind of participative processes. Just considering like the role of social media, people maybe have might take less indication from their own parties, but also the growth of social movements that are happening online, both for good and bad, and just a little bit of your reflections on that. Thank you.
So if I can just pick up on that, the thing you need to understand is voting is extremely routinized in Switzerland. So it's a normal procedure that every party or every social movement or NGOs or unions or employers associations, they, you know, in their calendar, they really time it in the decision about their vote recommendation. And this will be up there 6 weeks before the vote, so everyone will know, they communicate it to everyone. So this is really a routine matter. All the parties, all the NGOs will communicate this, and this is also something that's picked up on social media. So we have a poll that looks at what kind of social media people use, and parties are very active, NGOs are very active, so they want to get out their vote recommendation, so to make sure that people can vote heuristically. Ironically, is the more intensive the campaign is, the less people tend to vote heuristically, because then they start to think about the arguments, about the facts. So it's a bit contradictory, because there is an interest of parties to get the recommendation out, but people follow them less if the parties are successful getting those.
Okay. A little bit of disinformation as well.
Why is disinformation?
so I suppose influencing people's decisions, even if you're sitting in a citizens assembly, you know, where are you going for your extra information? There's just such a wider landscape that you can get that from now, and also can make, I think, processes like assemblies, or we would certainly see it every time there's anything close to a referendum election, disinformation online targeting that immediately, because that is where people are having those conversations. You know, politicians are very visible in Ireland, in as much as we're a small country, they'll knock on the door. That's not where people are having the conversations, would be our experience. They are having them online. So is that a much bigger challenge now to, even when you were on the assemblies, you know, are people really still very influenced by the online conversations? How can we really fight back?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to hark back to get people in person, you know, give them the skills to have conversations. I think that's we're losing the art of how to actually speak to each other. And I think that the more time we spend online, and I think maybe it's at a tipping point now, but, you know, I think that information isn't necessarily what we're in need of. We're looking for guidance, which is not information. You know, we're looking for support with decision making, which is not just information. So they're different things, I think. Yeah.
Joseph, do you want to have a final word before I'll have to let people go? If there was anything from Cian's question there.
Yeah, sure. On disinformation, yeah, no, it's obviously a huge problem. And I think the only way we get out of this in any kind of way, like, there's always been disinformation, but the problem is it's like disinformation on steroids now.
Yeah.
And what is it that's making it like that? Like, what's making it so extreme? And it's the way the algorithms are set up on, I'm not saying anything original here. I mean, like, the purpose of the algorithms is to get you addicted and to reinforce things that you like. It's not to inform you. It's not for the overall user experience, or it's not for mental health, or it's not of any of these things. It's to profit maximize for the companies that are putting these products forward, and that has these very deleterious effects on all those things I mentioned: mental health, the political culture, everything. So, you know, we never anticipated, when we were talking about things like free speech and free enterprise and all that, we never quite considered these particular harms. They're there now, and maybe we need to reconsider some of our other values so that we can regulate this much better, and yeah, make them a proper public square.
Fantastic. Value-driven conversation. That's what I keep hearing here today. Amazing. Apologies to the people I didn't get to online. Great questions as well. I don't know how to get them to them, but I think we did touch on some of those points. Huge thanks to the IIEA and the Embassy of Switzerland in Ireland for facilitating really great conversation that I've learned a lot from. I have to go change everything we do in the media now as a result. And of course, the biggest thanks to Louise Caldwell and to Professors Daniel Krugler and Joseph Lacey for giving us so much time and their expertise going forward. I think we're kind of in safe hands if we keep this level of research and expertise and advocacy up. So can I get a round of applause, please, Dan?